Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to greet you all this afternoon for a special UC Santa Cruz online laser talk. I'm Rachel Nelson of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences. LASER stands for Leonardo Art and Science Evening Rendezvous and are an international program bringing together artists, scientists, and scholars for presentations and conversations. We've been hosting laser talks for 7 years at the Institute of the Arts and Sciences. And one of the delights has always been to gather people together from varied fields of research and with different interests into one room. Laser talks don't normally have a theme. So in one evening, you might experience presentations that deal with virtual reality and gaming, or that talk about visualizations of data, or give insights into mass extinction and climate change. There's a unique pleasure in being in rooms with people with vastly diverse interests and knowledges to share and make connections. But as we've moved this program online, we've also found that they offer another kind of pleasure. We can hone in on certain subjects and bring people together around shared concerns. And tonight we've decided to concentrate on what laser talks are particularly well suited to, the thinking between disciplines at the convergences of art and science. We're happy that today we have amazing guests that can help us think about the importance of thinking across the creative and the analytic, with David G. Stork and collaborators Yolande Harris and Ari Friedlaender joining us. For this special online event, we'll have a slightly changed program to our in-person lasers. David Stork will speak first, and Yolande Harris and Ari Friedlander will follow. For our online version, we have limited the number of presentations so that we'll have time for your questions. I encourage you to ask them as you think of them throughout the presentations by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. After the presentations, I'll share your questions with our speakers, and really ask them as you think of them. We'll make sure not to lose any of them. And I look forward to a lively, if distant, conversation. I also want to mention that this event is being recorded and will be archived at the Institute of the Arts and Sciences website, ias.ucsc.edu, and on the UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lectures YouTube channel. Thanks to our friends in University Relations Special Events for making this so seamless. So now for our first presentation. It is a real pleasure to introduce David G. Stork. Stork is currently lecturer in computer science at Stanford University. He's a graduate in physics from MIT and the University of Maryland, and has held faculty positions in a variety of disciplines, including physics, mathematics, computer science, statistics, electrical engineering, neuroscience, psychology, and art history. He's lectured on computer methods for analyzing fine art paintings and drawings in major museums, universities, and conferences in 30 countries. It's a real pleasure to have him here, and thank you so much, David, for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. It's always a great joy to speak to the laser community. It's one of the very few in the world in which you can count on individual attendees to be interested in both science and the arts, which is essential for the kind of work I'm going to describe today. I'll be answering the question, did Tim paint a Vermeer? And this is work done with my collaborators, Christopher Tyler, a vision scientist at the Smith-Kettlewell Institute and in San Francisco and the City University of London, and Sarah Schechner, a historian of science at Harvard. Well, we're all familiar with Johannes Vermeer, one of the greatest artists of all time. In his short 42-year life, he left us just about 40 paintings, among them some of the most sublime and beautiful ever created, including Girl with a Pearl Earring, View of Delft, A Glass of Wine, and his favorite painting, The Art of Painting. This subtlety of his rendering of the effects of light and perspective and balance and so forth makes these paintings look almost photographic. And it's led some scholars to hypothesize or ask the question, at least, did Vermeer use optics when he was executing these works? Well, we have to note that we know that some artists have used optics, like Canaletto in the late 18th century would build a simple camera obscura, basically a box with a lens in front of it, to project an image onto the back wall, trace it, and then use a technique called gridding to expand it onto his canvas for his cityscapes of Venice and London and elsewhere. And the great American realist Thomas Eakins took black and white photos and then projected these slides onto his canvas, traced them, including for the bathers here, and would later then fill in paint. And of course, the photorealists worked directly from photographs, but in their studio, they would then project, some of them, including Richard Estes, would project them onto their canvas and trace over them and fill in paint. But whether Vermeer did or not has really stumped a lot of scholars for many, many decades. And that's the question I'm going to be addressing today. The first suggestions came from the connoisseur and great scholar of Dutch art, Lawrence Gowing, in the late 50s, but he could just speculate. It was Philip Steadman, academic in London, who really took up the challenge and experimentally showed what he thought was a way that Vermeer could have used optics to make his sublime paintings. I'll spend one slide addressing this. I should mention that there were a lot of problems with Steadman's explanations, and he himself has basically stepped back from it, preferring instead, quote, something like Tim's Vermeer, which is going to be our central focus today. So Steadman's hypothesis is shown on the left. It's a schematic of Vermeer's studio, in which he believes Vermeer built a small camera obscura room with a lens in it that would project an image of the scene of the tableau onto the rear wall, where he believes Vermeer would trace it, then later take that tracing and transfer it to a canvas and so forth. And the evidence that convinces him or excited him most is shown on the right panel. It's an overhead view or plan of the studio on the left with those colored lines. And depending upon the location of the lens, you would have different, they're called visual pyramids or the angles of view. And if the lens is close to the rear wall, you can expect a small painting. If the lens is far from the wall, you can expect a big painting. And he shows 6 paintings that he believed were executed in Vermeer's studio, and shows a good correlation between the, we'll call it predicted size, and the actual sizes. Well, recently there's been a real fly in the ointment of that explanation. It turns out that 2 of these paintings we know almost certainly were not executed in Vermeer's studio. They were executed in the homes of wealthy gunpowder merchants near Delft. And that reduces the statistical anomalies or the statistical uniqueness dramatically. And yet there are other aspects. But again, our real focus is on another explanation, proposed explanation for how Vermeer might have worked. And that came from Tim Jenison in the blue shirt. Tim is an electrical engineer. He started a software company for making computer graphics software. He has never painted a painting in his life. He has never studied studio art. And yet he took it upon himself to paint a painting as good as a Vermeer. And his long and arduous efforts are documented in this documentary film, Tim's Vermeer. The producers were Penn and Teller, the famous magicians from Las Vegas. And you see the painting in the upper left panel. But here is the painting that he sought to duplicate or replicate, Vermeer's Lady and a Gentleman at the Virginals. Really sublime work. And Tim spent years, literally years, building furniture, reconstructing the room, blasting out the walls of his warehouse in order to reinstall windows, much like Vermeer's, all in order to get a studio that matched as closely as he felt possible to what Vermeer would have had in Delft. And here is the core idea. This is Jenison explaining his mirror telescope method. The studio is off to the left. We don't see it, but his optical device consists of first a converging lens. Imagine taking a big lens off of the front of a camera, so that focuses light. At the right, we have a concave mirror, like a shaving or makeup mirror, which also can focus light, as any physicist, optical scientist can tell you. And the core novelty, the real invention, if you will, is this central piece, which is a plane mirror angled at 45 degrees. Now, of course, a plane mirror have been known for centuries, but it's how it's used that is the core of Jenison's idea. So light comes from the studio, from the woman, the virginals, the man, and so forth, through the lens, passes past the plane mirror to the concave mirror, reflects back to the plane mirror, and then reflects vertically. The artist looks down onto the little mirror and hence sees the scene in an image. But just to the side of the mirror, he can also see the table that you see here. And on that table would be the painting, flat, facing up, not on an easel, but flat like a plate facing up. Here's a computer ray tracing diagram of the situation. I've flipped it left to right so that the tableau is off to our right. The light passes through the converging lens, past the plane mirror to the concave mirror, then to the plane mirror and up. The artist looks down, and then you can see now where the canvas is and the table. And the core process is illustrated here. Here's Tim looking at the mirror and seeing in reflection off that 45-degree mirror, an image. This happens to be a photograph of his father, but he's seeing that in reflection. But just to the edge of the mirror, he can see his canvas down below on the table where he's applying paint. And now along that edge, he can compare what he sees reflected in the mirror and what he sees directly on the canvas that he's painting. And this exploits the human visual system's superb ability to recognize the slightest differences in color and in shape. Even a slightest break in a line is easily visible, something called Vernier acuity. And so he keeps adjusting the paint until the match along the edge of the mirror is so good that what he has painted matches the scene extremely closely. You can find the location of where he should place his telescope using simple geometrical optics and perspective. Here, 4 replications of the computer graphics model of the tableau, of the scene, and there's a painting shown in there. And depending upon where the artist's eye is, you'll get different perspectives. They're all in perfect perspective. It's just whether it's accelerated perspective at the top or orthographic perspective at the bottom or somewhere in between. And here, because the perspective is so good, we can use computer techniques to build 3D computer graphics models of the scene, the tableau. This is done by my colleague, Antonio Cremonese. And you can sort of fly around and see things from different directions. Again, all because the perspective is so good in Vermeer's original painting. And then, after 130 days of 8-hour-a-day painting, this is what Tim produced, his first painting. Tim's Vermeer on the left and Vermeer's Vermeer on the right. And it's pretty impressive. The shading and the coloring and the geometry is really quite good. So he's acting like a photocopier or camera, if you will. But so the question, did Tim paint a Vermeer? Well, you can answer that for yourself. He painted something that very much looks like it. But of course, our real question is, did Vermeer use a technique very similar to what Tim is proposing? So here are some of the arguments and evidence. I'll go through 2 of them very quickly and spend rest of my time on the last 4. The first is the telescope and mirror comparator. Historians of optics assure us, would have been the world's most complicated optical system on the planet. It was their Hubble telescope. Again, from an artist, not a scientist like Isaac Newton or Cassegrain and others and so forth. There's no textual evidence Vermeer even owned optics. No records of him purchasing, no one who came to his home ever mentioned it. In his estate after he dies, there's not even a single lens mentioned, and so on. This argues, of course, against him having used optics. But now to the evidence and arguments that I will spend some time on. In brief, there's some optical evidence that has long intrigued art scholars that is not explained in Vermeer's paintings. Those refer to blur spots, as I'll show you. There's also a single bowed contour in Vermeer's painting on the virginals, on the harpsichord, if you will. And the evidence that got the proponents most excited and most convinced involves tonal accuracy, the ability to render the shading on the rear wall, on the floor, and throughout the tableau. And then we have some evidence of independent reenactments, other people trying to use Tim's method. Okay, the blur spots. Here's Vermeer's Lace Maker in the Louvre. And if you look very closely at passages in this and many other Vermeer paintings, you find that it looks, I'll call it, out of focus. This is a sharp picture of a painting where the dots and so forth appear blurry. This is called a pointillet technique. And it's the kind of evidence you've seen in photographs that are somewhat blurry or have what we say is limited depth of field, that one object in a photograph can be sharp, but objects closer or farther away would be blurry and have this kind of pointillet effect. Well, Tim's method does not explain this whatsoever. Looking down onto the mirror, you will never see these kinds of blurry effects. Your eye automatically focuses, or so-called accommodates, to get rid of them. That's why you don't see them when you're looking at your computer screen or out your window or anything like this. So some of the most important optical evidence that intrigued a lot of scholars, including me, does not get explained using the mirror-comparator technique. The second evidence involves a slight bowing in a single contour on the virginals. If you squeeze this portion of the painting left to right in Vermeer's original, you find there's a very slight bowing or curve in a contour we would normally expect to be straight. And Tim Jenison suggests that maybe this was because Vermeer used his optics a little bit improperly, that he shifted things, didn't set it up quite right, and that could indeed lead to a slight curve. However, that argument really holds no water because all the other lines are straight, including the ones right below it, right above it, right to the left of it, just to the, all throughout are perfectly straight. That it would be one individual curve seems extremely unlikely, given that all the other ones are straight. Moreover, we find in some other paintings, contemporaneous paintings, like Gabriel Metsu's Lady at the Virginals, that you might find even a very slight curve in that single line as well on this Virginals, even though no one seriously suspects that Metsu used any sort of optics. And again, all the lines are straight here. So that argues against it. But the evidence that got the proponents most excited involved tonal fidelity. That is to say, the accurate representation or the rendering of the shading along the rear wall and on the floor and indeed throughout the entire tableau. Philip Steadman, again, a convert, if you will, to Tim Jenison, says, quote, "The most powerful evidence has to do with tonality. Fall off in lightness along the back wall cannot be seen. Not even Vermeer could have seen the difference between the luminance at the right and the left. You just cannot see a shadow gradient in tone like that." And Jenison says, such a gradient is, quote, something that an artist really cannot see. It would have been invisible. It's impossible to see. Well, here's a computer graphics model of the scene using strict radiosity. That is to say, it's getting the lightness extremely accurate according to the laws of physics and so forth. And you can easily see the fall off in lightness across the back wall. I think the proponents are really mixing two visual phenomena. One is lightness constancy or color constancy, which means that yes, you can see that it's the same color going from left to right, that it's all a beige, or would it be a white or a green or so forth, something like this, a phenomenon that's been well understood for well over a century. But the second visual process is being able to understand the overall luminance, how bright it is. And that's a separate process. And indeed, it's very easy to see that it's dark at the right, bright at the left. If you look around your room, you can do it all the time, no problem whatsoever. Here's a photograph of a reconstruction of a tableau for Vermeer's Lady Standing at a Virginal, a different painting, but you can easily see this fall off in brightness from the on the rear wall near the window and to the right. And I've looked through many paintings, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens, contemporaneous and elsewhere, where this kind of fall off in luminance is easily seen, easily represented, and so forth, including in the upper right, that's a 1921 painting by Edward Hopper. No one suggests he used any form of optics whatsoever, not even a camera. So he can get it quite easily. And one way to see this is by clipping out the gradient. For instance, at the top, it's that computer graphics model. And then I took that exact detail, that panel, and then flipped it left to right to show that, yes, it's very easy to see that there's quite a difference there that we saw by our own eyes 3 or 4 slides ago. And here's the second one is Tim Jenison's painting, and then Vermeer's, the third is Vermeer's itself, Peter de Hoog's Young Woman Drinking, and elsewhere, even Edward Hopper's Girl at a Sewing Machine. So this kind of luminance gradient is really quite easy to see. What about the luminance on the floor tiles? The proponents point out that indeed there are the Vermeers on the left. They're all Vermeers, but the lady and gentleman at the virginals is at the left. It's possible to have a white tile, in this case, in the shade that looks white to us, but it actually is darker paint than a black tile that is in bright light. This is a very well understood phenomenon called lightness constancy and so forth. And all you have to do is be able to see it to be able to paint it. And I'll give you evidence that an artist can in fact do that in a moment. But notice these are 3 of those remaining 4 paintings that Steadman said were done in Vermeer's studio. Look at the patterns of the tiles. They're different. That means that he must have been inventing or, drawing different, floor patterns for the different ones for artistic reasons. And therefore, if he used some sort of optical method, he would have had to have shifted the telescope to render one tile when he was in fact looking at somewhere else. Well, that's not a strong counter argument, but I'll come to a much stronger one in a moment. So the floor patterns differ. It's unlikely they were copied, at least not directly. But was there ever really a floor tile in Vermeer's studio? Well, recent scholarship suggests very strongly no. These floors were called Italian floors, named for the white Carrara marble that came from Italy. The black tiles would have come from Belgium, less expensive. But they always appeared on almost always appeared on ground floors, whereas Vermeer worked upstairs, where you wouldn't have had such a floor. They're almost always in entranceways and so forth. And they were expensive. They were really just for the wealthy. Remember, Vermeer was very poor. He basically died of poverty. He had 15 children, 9 who survived to childhood. And he died at 42, basically due to the crushing poverty that he had to experience. So it seems very unlikely that there was even a tile floor in his studio that he would have, quote, copied using one of those projectors. And the great and late Vermeer scholar Walter Liedtke has talked about many aspects of Vermeer's paintings that are, quote, fictive, that are not based on something seen before him, but something that he just added and drew in. My final point, an artist, Jonathan Janson, not Jenison, Janson, who has decades-long expertise in Vermeer, tried to paint the lightness on a rear wall in a Vermeer studio, reconstructed studio. And as he writes, I was surprised to discover that I had been able to come very close to the true tones without using optics when I checked them with the comparator. In short, you don't need a comparator in order to get those gradients properly. But this technique was unbelievably difficult for Janson. He tried for many, many times to try to get the system to work. I was unable to align the optics on my own, so Tim had to intervene every time I wished to move to a new area to be painted. I was unable to proceed without Tim's repositioning all 3 optical elements. I was almost completely unable to align the elements correctly so that I could progress from one area to the scene to the other, except for tiny movements to the left or right. The telescope would allow you to see only a very small part of the whole tableau at one time, so you had to move around again and again. Very, very difficult. So in summary, the mirror-comparator catadioptric telescope would have been the most complicated optical system on the planet. No one's suggested anything that counteracts this statement. No, there's no textual evidence Vermeer knew about, used, or even owned optics. You can hypothesize and you can surmise that he knew Van Leeuwenhoek and others, but we have no documentary textual evidence to support this speculation. The mirror technique does not explain the optical blur spots, the pointillé I showed you. That single bowed curve, if it was due to aberrations, we should see bowing throughout the entire painting, but we do not. The mirror-comparator technique is very slow, difficult, and extremely frustrating. Even Jenison himself, in his documentary movie, says if he weren't making a documentary, he would have given up and found something else to do. Claims Vermeer could not have seen the luminance gradient are patently false. I think they're based on a scientific misunderstanding between lightness constancy and the ability, well understood ability to sense luminance. And many artists, and one reenacting of Vermeer, can easily capture that tone that we were told was, quote, impossible to see. So in answer to the question, did Tim paint a Vermeer? Well, we saw his work and it's quite impressive. But our real question is, did Vermeer use a mirror comparator? And looking at all the evidence and all the arguments and counter arguments, I think the answer has to be no. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David, for that fascinating talk. I hope that everybody, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. We'll get to them soon. Before we do that, however, we're going to switch from David to Ari and Yolande. So, and at the IAS, I have to say that we've been plotting with Ari and Yolande for future collaborations. So I'm thinking about today also as a kind of sneak peek. I'm happy to introduce them. Ari Friedlaender is an associate researcher at the Institute for Marine Sciences at UC Santa Cruz. His work focuses on using advanced telemetry tools to study the underwater behavior of marine mammals and how it's affected by changes in their environment, including climate change and ocean noise across a range of their habitats. As an educator, Ari works with several organizations to combine art and science to develop curriculum to share information broadly about marine mammals and conservation. He's the co-founder of the California Ocean Alliance and has published nearly 100 scientific papers and has been featured in numerous documentary film series. Yolande Harris is an artist and researcher exploring ideas of sonic consciousness. Her projects consider techniques of navigation, expanding perception beyond the range of human senses, the technological mediation of underwater environments, and our relations to other species. She's presented her work internationally over the last 20 years, including the ICA London, Sharon Kunsthal Frankfurt, the House of World Cultures Berlin, and the Exploratorium at San Francisco. Yolande holds a PhD from Leiden University and is currently research associate at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Yolande and Ari can tell you about their shared work exploring the visual and sonic underwater worlds inhabited by whales. I'm so glad they can join us tonight.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, David, for that that talk ahead of us. That was fascinating stuff. I'm really excited to be here and to be able to participate in this lectureship series. To talk a little bit about whales to an audience that is unlikely very familiar with whales, but more so because it represents this really fun collaboration that Rachel mentioned between myself and Yolande to try and come up with ways to share information in novel ways between science and the arts. And so hopefully what we'll do tonight is share a little bit of information about what I do as a scientist, and then transition to Yolande talking about the exhibit and the way that that information is then turned into an art installation. So this scene to me is really important because it represents a few things about whales and about their environment that I think are good to think about ahead of time. This shows a group of Antarctic minke whales in a beautiful bay in the Antarctic Peninsula, and they're all at the surface. And this is where we could see those animals. They're mammals, they breathe air, but they spend about 95% of their time below the surface. And in order for us to really understand how these animals behave and how things in their environment affect them, we need to develop tools to study them when they're out of sight from us. And I'll talk a little bit about what those tools are and how they lead to really interesting pieces of information. So one of the things that's really cool about whales, and baleen whales in specific, these animals that have this very evolved structure in their mouth, just like a comb made out of keratin that sieves out very small fish or plankton from the ocean. And one of the things that's very interesting about whales to me is that over evolutionary time, over the last 100 million years, there's been this repeated and independent evolution of animals in the ocean that filter out very small things. And these animals that have evolved a strategy to feed that way tend to also be incredibly large. And that's because in the ocean, production or life is really started from the combination of light and chemicals. And you have a biomass of small plants and animals in the ocean that is unrivaled anywhere else on the planet. So if you want to get big, you find a prey resource that is very available to you. And then in order to stay big, your energetic demands become very great. You need to be able to eat a lot. So there's this sort of continuum or this feedback loop in the ocean of animals that are big, that have an ability to feed a lot. And because they feed a lot, they have an ability to get big. So animals like manta rays, whale sharks, basking sharks, and baleen whales are all sort of representatives of this independent evolution of how animals are able to grow very big in the ocean. And baleen whales, specifically the blue whale, the biggest animal that's ever lived on our planet. So one of the cool things about whales too is that they integrate over different spatial and temporal scales depending on their behavior and throughout their lifetimes. And because of that, I think they make for a really good research platform to study ocean processes. So a feeding event by a whale, when it takes a mouthful of water, occurs over a number of seconds to a number of minutes, and it occurs at the scale centimeters to meters. An individual dive for a whale or for an elephant seal may go hundreds of meters, almost down to several kilometers, and may take minutes to hours. And throughout their lifetimes, these different things like a foraging bout, and then their feeding season, their migration patterns, and then over their lifespan, you see that different things that they do occur over these big or little spatial scales, but also temporal scales. And because of that, the things that happen in the ocean sort of end up being manifested in whales. So places in the ocean that are very productive over periods of time are places where you're going to have a lot of whales. And because of that, I'll talk a little bit about the end about why I think whales are a really valuable thing to study. So I just mentioned that the presence of whales really reflects oceans that are healthy. And that's because, as I mentioned before, in order for a whale to be there, there needs to be a lot of food. And in order for there to be a lot of food, you need to have the right conditions. Monterey Bay, where we live, is one of those places where you have this perfect combination of nutrients and light to grow plants. The Antarctic is another one of those places, and that's where I'm going to be talking about most of the work that we do there. But because of that, to me, I think you can use the presence of places on the planet where you have whales or you have seals or you have these big aggregations of animals as places that reflect healthy ocean ecosystems. And what my group and my research is trying to do is to use a suite of technology to try and increase our knowledge of these poorly known species. And not only are they poorly known to science, but it's really also poorly known how they are impacted by things like climate change, by Navy sonar, by the things that we as humans put into the ocean, either indirectly through carbon emissions or directly through sonar or the sounds of ships or other activities that we do in the ocean. So this is one of the beautiful things that we get to do. This is a drone image looking at our small little research boat in the Antarctic. This is one of my favorite places in the world. This is Wilhelmina Bay in the Antarctic. And to me, what this represents is you see that the surface of the ocean, while it might be flat and there's not a lot of wind here, is not uniform. There is sea ice, there are icebergs, there are patches of small ice here and there. And the surface of the ocean is a very interesting interface. And it's something that animals that dive and that breathe air have to contend with in terms of where they're going. They may be using icebergs to haul out on if you're a seal, but if you're a whale and you're trying to navigate under this, you need to be able to find those places of open water in order to breathe. So at the surface, we see a really interesting dynamic environment, but how well that represents what's below the surface it's almost anybody's guess, but it's almost very likely to be quite different than that. So as a researcher, we have to come up with a number of different types of tools to study these animals. Depending on the scale, the spatial scale and the temporal scale, and the question that we're asking, if we're asking something like how long do whales migrate for and where do they go, we may use a technology like a satellite transmitter. If we want to know how many whales are in Monterey Bay, we may do an aerial survey and cover a large area and count how many animals are there. If we're interested in the presence of animals that are making sounds, we can use passive acoustics and listen to the ocean. If we want to understand the contaminant loads in those animals or how many animals are pregnant, we need to collect small biopsy skin samples or blubber samples. And if we want to understand what happens below the surface, we need to deploy tags or instruments that sit on these animals and that tell us about what they're doing underwater. And this is an image taken from a drone, which is another tool that we use to help us measure the size and the body condition of animals. And this is a beautiful humpback whale next to our boat in the Antarctic that's giving us a very nice look at its belly. So one of the things, and you'll see on here, are the tags that we've developed to study these animals. And this is a small little Antarctic minke whale that's coming up and that's being quite curious to us as a little intruder into its environment. And you can see this little red and black tag that's on its back that's attached via suction cups. And this video to me represents a couple of things. First, it represents how foreign we look and how foreign our tags look in this environment. But it also, to me, represents the curiosity that these animals have and the things that are going on in their lives and in their brains to consider us as not a threat to them at this point, but something that's curious and something that's different in their environment that they're interested in seeing very much in the same way that we're interested in seeing them. The other thing that you notice is that we've got a boat full of gear and that we are not well equipped if we ever fall in the ocean there. Those animals are supremely evolved for the marine environment, and it takes everything working perfectly for us just to get back at the end of the day. So the tool that we use is what we call it's a motion sensing dive recording tag. And these tags apply on the animals with suction cups. They stay on the animal for about 1 or 2 days. You can see in this picture here that the tag is at the end of about a 20-foot pole. And we just slap the tag on the back of the animal. The tag itself was like a little mini computer, kind of like a smartphone. It measures the motion sense of the animal, the pitch, the roll, the heading of the animal, the depth of the animal, the position. It records the audio or all the sounds that are ambient to the environment of the whale, as well as the sounds that it produces. And then this one also has a video camera on there. And this has become a really important tool for us to be able to understand what it is about the environment around the whale that may be affecting why an animal does something. And without seeing sort of from the whale's perspective what the environment is like, it's hard to infer some of that information. So these are the tags we're using that have been developed over time for that kind of use. So one of the things that we get are these fantastic images as whales as wildlife documentary film producers. This is taken from the back of a humpback whale in a feeding aggregation off of South Africa. And just from the whale's perspective, you get to see other animals in the environment feeding. That was a humpback whale that was lunge feeding right through the surface. There's a sea lion that you also see in the frame. So you learn a little bit about the environment and who is in that area. You also saw kind of that snow of krill, which is the prey that the animals are feeding on. So you see a bit of the context of the environment around the whale just by looking at the video. This next video will illustrate sort of another perspective. So here you're on the back of a Minke whale. The head of the whale is on the left part of the screen. The dorsal fin is on the right-hand part of the screen. And you can see the whale is basically cruising just below the surface, and you can see sea ice that this animal is cruising below. You also see a whole bunch of numbers and figures, and this is effectively the data streams from all of those sensors that show you the motion of the animal, whether it's pitched up or down, whether it's rolling left or right, what direction it's heading. You can think about this as telling you the speed and the depth of the animal. And if we didn't have this video, we would have to use all of those numbers and squiggly lines to interpret the behavior of the animal. But because we have that video, we can link that up with the things that we see in the sensors to corroborate when we see an animal feeding or when we see an animal surfacing. And with the video, we also can say, aha, this is how that animal changed its behavior because it was in an environment with sea ice or because there were other animals close to it. So this to us is really the culmination of a lot of science that's been done in the past with just sensors and a little bit of new technology to help us infer behavior. And I'll let it play just for another 5 or 6 seconds here. You're going to see the whale accelerate very quickly and open its mouth right there. And you see the krill kind of filtering past it. So that was a feeding event. And without that video showing us the animal opening its mouth, it may be very difficult for us to interpret the sensor data to accurately infer what the animal is doing underwater. So hopefully this is a very brief introduction to what whales are and how we try and study them. And I think that whales represent this really fascinating and unique vehicle for sharing information. I mentioned that as a top predator in the ocean that needs this abundance of prey, they help to reflect ocean health in where they're present and where their numbers are quite high. There's also this heuristic value that we have for allowing nature to live and to live on its own just for the sake of being there. And I think that's very important. Whales also, and marine mammals in general, evoke a very strong emotional response to people because they have culture. They have traditions. They pass information among individuals and among generations. They have strong social communities. And these are things that humans connect with in our own society. And that helps to promote them to be an important way to motivate people to conserve and protect oceans. And because of that, they're a great ambassador. But I think even more so beyond the science, we need to come up with ways to share information in sort of new and novel ways that bring people in from different perspectives or other places that may not have access to this. And so this is where working with Rachel at the Institute, and then more specifically with Yolande, in collaborating with artists and thinkers who have these diverse ways of sharing and communicating information, it can increase our knowledge, our understanding, and our empathy towards whales, towards oceans, and the impacts that humans have on our environment. And I think the better we are as scientists at understanding how art can be communicated, or information can be communicated through art, the better we can start to try and change the way that we do science to help make that bridge and that connection a little tighter. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Yolande to talk about actually the next step in that process.
Thank you, Ari. I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. I'm going to first show a few examples of previous work that I have done, mainly around sound, underwater sound, and then I will go on into the work with Ari. So that will be the second half. So I wanted to begin with this quote from Ania Lockwood, who is a composer and sound artist, worked a lot with environmental sound, and she describes my work as a Mobius strip of expanding awareness that moves out from one's own body to immediate place, to other phenomena, on to remote environments, and then back to the self. And this is a kind of, she describes it as a sense of interdependence. And the works that I do, they really focus on one's physiological, psychological, bodily sense, and as a kind of embodied knowing, and trying to tap into that when you experience these works. And the importance of that is that, as she says, they evoke and encourage this sense of independence that's vital for the transformation into good stewards of our environmental neighborhoods. And I think of our environmental neighborhood as here in Santa Cruz is the ocean. But what is the ocean in terms of a neighborhood? It doesn't have boundaries. It doesn't accept perhaps the surface. And then when we think of the surface, as Ari already showed, what is the surface of the ocean? It is a surface that we see, and therefore as we see it, we assume it's sort of a barrier of some kind. And I am looking at how we can use technologies and tools and ways of listening that can help us to remove that sense of surface boundary, surface as boundary. And this goes into ideas of the surface of the skin, the surface of the screen. So in this case, we're looking at the surface of the ocean. So I primarily have been focusing on sound, and in the underwater world, sound is the main form of survival, of living, of being, basically. You can only see, one can only see short distances, and yet sound travels very fast and very far. And when I work with sound as a human, I realize that I'm limited by my physical, the range of my hearing range, my attention span, ideas of scale, whether I'm selective with my hearing. So there are limitations that come with sound and with listening. And those are the kind of limitations that through this work, I'm trying to explore how we could ever really understand something as different in scale as the ocean, and how we can somehow come closer to it, even if we cannot access it ourselves. How do we give the ocean a sense of presence? And by giving it a sense of presence that we can experience in some way, we have it's less likely that we will ignore it. And I think that's really key. So with that, I want to show you these first works with these headphones, called nicknamed the Whale Walks. And these were developed as a project in Dundee, Scotland in 2017. And it was a commission to make a work that was about the whaling history of Dundee. And Dundee is a small town, port town off the east coast of Scotland. And they, the main whaling industry was in the Arctic. So I managed to get hold of recordings, contemporary current recordings of the Arctic Ocean, of beneath the surface, beneath the ice, from Kate Stafford, a scientist at the University of Washington, and used those sound recordings to create a sound piece that you would listen to on the edge of the harbor in Dundee. So looking out across the bay, you would hear the voices of these animals that are now, their voices are in the Arctic now, but at the time they were being brought in dead on these whaling ships. And the idea of these headphones is that they are braided with this an old ancient Celtic braiding technique. It's a 16-strand hollow braid. And that to me was a sense of tactility of the jute industry that was parallel with the whaling industry in Dundee. And it sort of symbolizes this intertwinement of the cultural lives of both the whales and of humans. So I want you to notice how you experience those sounds as from other beings that we have this history with. This is a quote from Brandon LaBelle, a sound theorist, who is commenting on these whale walks of mine. And what I want to sort of emphasize is that, you know, he says these sounds are at once distant from our earthly territory, our terrestrial senses, while they in turn immerse us within their sudden proximity. The immensity of their sounds, the great depth and dimension of their sonority are brought right up against our skin, delivering all this depth and resonance into our listening. And this ability to put these headphones on and have them in your ears and have this this scale brought into one's human sensing that I'm trying to activate in some way. This took me to a piece called Melt Me Into the Ocean. It was a project that I brought to Santa Cruz, which is where I'm based. And I wanted to look at the Monterey Bay as you know, what is our environmental stewardship of our neighborhood? What is our environmental neighborhood in terms of this ocean? And here it is. This is off the harbor in Santa Cruz by the lighthouse, the Walton Lighthouse. And these sounds that she is listening to here are collected from the shoreline and also from a deep ocean hydrophone that is in the Monterey Bay Canyon, which is deep down right off where she's looking there. And the sounds are a mixture of animal sounds. There are some boat noises, and there's also an ocean hiss that sort of permeates the whole thing. And the idea is that you walk, as you walk along from the land and you move out past the ocean and onto this very sort of distant promontory into the ocean, you can look and in some way augment one's senses into imagining what it might be to kind of melt into this ocean space. So here's a little video giving some idea of the presence of an idea of physically moving and walking while listening. This is like taken to other places because these are portable, these headphones. It's like being able to portably take the ocean sounds with you to different places. So here is the Exploratorium listening to whales. And it was part of an evening where, as it got dark, these headphones are listened to within an immersive soundscape and video projections that others can hear. I've taken it to Lincoln, Nebraska, downtown in an urban environment where these whale sounds and these ocean voices from the Monterey Bay can have traveled. There's another example here in Arizona, in Wupatki, which is near the Hopi and Navajo reservations in Arizona, in the desert. So to the project From a Whale's Back at the Radius Gallery in Santa Cruz. This summer, we created this exhibition of using the material that Ari had shared with me. And when I approached him, he was so open about sharing this material. And I do think that there's no sense of necessarily kind of ownership of this material. It is about trying to reach audiences and share this material. So here is an image of how the tag is put on. And I want to just focus for a minute on the technology and the viewpoint. So this is the view from of the tag going on. This is a view from the tagger, and one may have see sort of reflections of the harpoonist, now scientist. And this then is the view from the tag camera itself. And now we're underwater. So we've let this, this tag take us from the surface, and now it is our extended eye beneath the ocean. So in this exhibition, there are 4 pieces that you can also see online individually, because this summer only few people at a time could visit the actual physical exhibition. This one, humpback swim through jellyfish. And this, I want to point out the way these jellyfish emerge out of a very short distance in front of you. So the importance of that, and also the way the whale breaks the surface and that kind of release into this air world that before we dive down again. This is a pod of orcas swimming together in Antarctica, and here I was taken by the closeness and the speed with which they swim and the way that they continuously vocalize. Here is the humpback's bubble net feeding in the Monterey Bay. And there we really see the depth that they dive to in the darkness. And the last one is the minke whale surfacing through ice. And so that is the most recent project that we've done together, and that we have very different ways of approaching the same material. And I'd like to hand it over to Ari if there's a final comment that you'd like to make.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Yolande. I think it's just, it's amazing to see this. And for me, one of the most wonderful things is to see how the information and the data that we collect as scientists can then be reinterpreted and shared to audiences to think about different ways of studying these animals and understanding them. And I'm so grateful that we have this opportunity through Rachel and Kristen and Diana and everybody at the Institute here at Santa Cruz to do these kinds of events.
Well, we're so glad that you were able to join us today and talk to us a little bit about your collaboration and your work. We have gotten some questions. I think David's going to join us now too. We've gotten some questions, and if anyone has any questions, please just add them into the Q&A and I will moderate them. I did want to ask, and just to start off, I actually have a question for everybody. I think that there's an interesting mix here in these presentations about augmented senses, about how we see and perceive that move between the talks that I thought was really interesting. But I did want to ask Ari and Yolande in particular about how, because I know something about this in the background, but how the pandemic has affected your work with the whales too, if you would give us a little hint of that.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, one of the things that we are most interested in, as Yolande mentioned, sound is such an important aspect of the lives of these animals, from communicating with one another to finding resources and background noise. Just noise pollution in general can really increase the stress levels in these animals. If you imagine yourself at a bar or a crowded room, you have to spend more energy to talk louder when there's more sound around you. And that has impacts on whales for sure. And one of the things that the pandemic has done locally is it has decreased the amount of boat traffic in Monterey Bay. And so we have a study that the National Science Foundation is helping to fund to look at the ocean sounds using the recordings that Yolande was talking about that are made in Monterey Bay about the ambient environment. And then we're collecting little blubber samples from the whales and looking at the stress hormones in them and linking how changes in the human sounds in the ocean link with changes in those stress hormones. And it'll be a really nice way to take advantage of this unfortunate sort of natural experiment that's going on. But it's very likely that we're going to see these demonstrative changes in how, when we don't use an area and we kind of don't pollute it with sound, that the whales respond very quickly to that in their stress levels.
That's fascinating. So David, we have a question for you too, and I think that it's you know, kind of gets to the heart of it, and it's about what the implications are if it were indeed confirmed that Vermeer did use optics for his painting.
Well, there are many implications of it. One is just it would highlight certain visual features within the painting and hence change our experience of standing in front of it. When I point out that pointillé to students, to anyone, they start seeing things differently and they start seeing the work as more sort of optical. And it could also help inform what's been going on with the history of optics. Oh, more optics was known than we thought at the time, or less. Who would have influenced whom? Where the techniques might be passed from one artist to another and so forth. And a lot of things on sort of the sociology of it. But again, I think most Vermeer scholars do not believe Vermeer used optics directly. Maybe I personally feel that he probably saw images in a camera obscura at some point. And as Walter Liedtke points out, that he made his paintings have this sort of optical look by adding pointillé and things like this. But I'm certainly not convinced that he directly used optics during the execution of his works.
So there's a follow-up question that I think ties in really well, which is there any evidence that any other artist of the era actually used such sophisticated optics?
Yes. Let's see. Jarrett Dow. There's evidence that Jarrett Dow, who painted extremely slowly, he may have used a concave mirror as a visual telescope, just to see things better so that he could paint them more carefully. Not that he was tracing anything, or maybe he used some sort of lines for grids for putting things down, but not a projection onto his screen. And he worked extremely slowly. He would take 5 days to paint a single hand. And he would sit in his studio for quite a long time until the dust settled, lest there be a speck of dust that ultimately gets on his paintings. And if you've ever seen his works, they have this realism, this freshness, and so forth. But, and he was a contemporary in the Dutch Golden Age, but we really get that kind of stuff much later than Vermeer.
Okay, so next question, Ari, I'm pretty sure is directly for you, but it asks what kind of jobs and internships should we take to have a job like yours where you're able to study marine mammals?
It's a great question. The thing about marine mammals is that you can study them from a physiological perspective, biology, communication, behavior, ecology. And so my general advice is to have that background in a particular discipline and then apply that to the things that you're most interested in. Marine mammals are wonderful for looking at diving physiology, for example, and UC Santa Cruz has wonderful facilities and labs that do that. The acoustics that they produce, we have great facilities for that, and so you can come at it from an acoustics perspective. But being a good general scientist is the first thing that you need to do, and then apply that theory and that foundation to a specific group of animals.
That's great, thank you so much. And Yolande, this question, there's a couple questions about the music that are in the compositions and that are noted as beautiful, but also kind of obviously human sounds that are being added in. So do you want to talk a little bit about that choice, that augment of the senses?
Yes, it is a very distinct choice. And sound and music work very, very differently in our psyche and our attention. If you put sound, if you're making a video and you put sound or music will draw the attention. So there is a distinct choice. Some of those videos had the ones that had really clear sound from the hydrophones, like the orcas vocalizing and the bubble net feeding. That was the sounds of those bubbles. I kept those sounds in. The others didn't have much sound apart from the minke whales moving through the ice, and this, which is really what you're hearing is the ice banging against the microphone. You're not hearing the ice making any sound, you're hearing the presence of the technology. So the presence of us, our I in some way. And so adding the music is also like adding our presence, our human musical idea of sound to create this space, this presence of us within that, and just try to help you reflect that this is a human viewpoint that we're having. This is not the viewpoint of the whale by any means. This is our technological extension that is going on. And so that's kind of why the music is there to allow you to recognize that and kind of help you through that, but it's not there all the time. It's not like, I do it a lot where it's completely dropped out, so.
So, and I'm trying to, just so everybody that's watching knows too, I'm trying to make sure that the questions move around a little bit. So that there are definitely follow-up questions we could ask, but I'm going to go to another question. And there's a question about Tim's Vermeer. Weren't there also some chromatic artifacts on edges that implied optics were used?
Yes. Little physics lecture here. If you have a simple lens, it's like a prism at some point. And so along the edge of a sharp contrast between, say, blue and yellow, the different colored rays will be focused to bent to different places. And so there could be a simple single color edge there. That would be sort of difficult to get in any optical system. You but also those things can arise just from the painting act itself. You can find those, that an edge is not perfectly sharp, one color than another color, even in works that we know for sure were not done with optics. But it's an intriguing hypothesis, but you should see it lots of places, not just a few, if it's really holding. And so it needs more work, but I'm not completely convinced from that either.
So there's a couple questions. Well, let me group a couple, right? So there's a question on, are there other beings beyond males in the oceans that make sounds that can be recorded? So this person's interested in crustaceans, all sorts of fish, even coral, and are interested in knowing if there's like an orchestra likeness in any places in our ocean. So I'm going to ask you to talk about that, but I'm also there's two like really practical questions too about tags. So what happens to the tags? Do they end up as debris in the ocean? And then also how come they can attach so instantaneously? So there's kind of like the
I'll get the mechanical ones out of the way first. I should have mentioned this. When we deploy the tags, all of the data is archived on there. So we need to retrieve those tags to get them back. So there's a small VHF transmitter and a small satellite transmitter as well that help us locate the position of the tag when the whale has shed it and it floats at the surface. We then go and recover it. The tags attach so quickly because there's a suction cup on them that's been designed with a very specific type of silicone that holds very well to these animals, can hold up for 2 or 3 days at a time. So if you get a good stick on the back of the whale, which are nice kind of flat surfaces, it sticks instantaneously. The other question is a great question for a woman named Colleen Reichmuth, who's one of the researchers at UC Santa Cruz, and she studies a lot of ocean sound and acoustics of animals. And the example that Yolande played, I think from Kate Stafford, where you had bearded seals, where you could hear those trills going up and down, and you could hear whales in the background making other sounds. There are places where you have these sort of high density aggregations of animals in the ocean that sound unbelievable. A guy named Doug Quinn did some work in the Antarctic that was similar to what Yolande showed from Kate. There are absolutely animals like crustaceans that make very loud sounds. Snapping shrimp. I don't know if it's mantis shrimp. There's some species of shrimp that makes one of the loudest sounds in the ocean for an animal that's 3 or 4 inches long. So there are almost innumerable places in the ocean where you can hear sound and animals that use sound to communicate.
Great. So for Yolande, were the sounds in the recordings people could listen to in Dundee in real time? That is the sound that dense all the time?
So yes, in the Dundee recordings, that is in real time. That's not edited in any way or overlaid. So that is how dense it is. And a lot of those sounds were the sounds of ice cracking and booming. So yeah, that is the density, which is amazing. Especially I like to just draw attention to the problem with human noise in the oceans that blankets out a lot of those sounds that the natural world that is so important. I mean, that is one of the big questions that the new work with Ari and the pandemic pause, if you like, in sound pollution is important. So how do we change our behaviors in such a way that that the stress levels, literally, we're experiencing very dramatic stress levels during this time, and yet how do we understand the stress levels of other species and how our behaviors are impacting them? So sound is important like that.
So David, there's a question about the value of the kind of mechanical optical techniques in Tim's painting of the Vermeer, and whether you think that would be of use in art schools and in teaching, like to actually practice those methodologies.
I'm not a studio artist. I have studied life drawing. I'm not very good. Yes, I think it could be, especially for some of the later artists, understanding, the way they worked and pigment mixing and so forth. So yeah, and there are lots of techniques on working from photographs and so forth. I'm not really expert enough to talk about. I'm closer to art history, not studio art. And as you find in the Academy, those are actually quite separate disciplines. So I'm punting on that question.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're totally allowed. So, okay, so Ari, besides vocalization for communication, do whales use sound for navigation?
Absolutely. And I've seen a couple of questions that I might be able to just sort of merge in here as well. So the baleen whales, largely we think use that sound for communication, and lower frequency sounds travel farther in the ocean. So a blue whale, for example, makes sounds that are lower than our hearing range, but can be detected on a hydrophone. And when you translate sound into energy, you can see the frequency that those sounds are made at. And those can travel hundreds of miles in the ocean. The higher frequency sounds that dolphins and porpoises make, which are considered that echolocation, where they literally create a sound that is so high frequency, it goes out of their bodies and bounces off of something, and the return echo off of a substance in the ocean that has a different density from water creates sort of an image in their head that they translate into seeing their environment. And those are above our hearing range as well. And the tags and the hydrophones that we use usually collect across a broad spectrum of frequencies so that we can see where all that energy of sound is, even if we can't physically hear it.
That's fascinating. So there's a question too from Whale Watch boat operator, who is curious about the study of the influence of boat noise on whales. So they write that there were a few months, April and May and part of June, with no charter boats permitted in Monterey Bay, but that private boaters were actually out in force. So were you specifically collecting your data from April and May when no charter boats were permitted to operate it? And were those your kind of quiet months, and what did you kind of get out of that? So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'd love to follow up with the person who asked that, because one of the things we want to do is canvass the whale watching community, because those are vessels that we have a pretty good idea about when they were out. We're using ticket information from landings and from the ports for when the recreational salmon fishery was going on, and from when recreational boats were being launched in the bay as well. So we should be able to distinguish recreational boating from whale watching boat traffic. And we collected a number of our samples from the week just prior to the salmon fishery opening up recreationally in the bay.
Fantastic. So this is a kind of a poignant question. It says, we're at such a difficult time in our ocean life and human pollution. Is there any way that this art science collaboration can beautifully drive this activist vision? This work looks beautiful, but makes me forget the plastics that I contribute to this ocean environment, which are also killing these cultures in life. So I think they're trying to think about that, the distancing mechanisms in which sometimes we function.
Yeah, I could let Yolande speak to this too, but from my personal perspective, I try not to get overwhelmed by the number of things that we do to our environment. And if I can focus on some that I can kind of get a little deeper dive into and sort of pick the battles that I can try and be more active about, those are the ones that I focus on. But plastics is a huge issue, you know, and there are so many that it can almost seem overwhelming. So I try and put the blinders on and do a smaller number that I think I can do a little bit more directly.
Yeah, I think that I hope this doesn't stop or prevent you from thinking about the plastics in the ocean. It hopefully would do something else and give you a connection to the ocean, to the experience of it, that would increase your interest in other forms of pollution in the ocean. And I think that is part of it. There's often you know, a suspicion of something that is beautiful, as the word was used. And those kind of experiences, you know, they can draw you in such a way that you feel like maybe you're losing the grip on the important questions. And I actually think that works rather differently. And that can be a way to increase one's empathy, increase one's understanding, and want to dive further into that. So,
You know, and that made me also think about something, David, that I've been thinking about a lot about yours, which is kind of like the what is painting question, right? Is it painting about sight or is painting about perception? And I mean, I think the lace, right, is the beautiful moment in the painting where it becomes about not only what we see, but about perception itself. But I just wanted you to, if you wanted to think about that too with us.
Oh gosh, I mean, the range of artistic expression that we experience in major museums is absolutely extraordinary, from, you know, Jackson Pollock to, you know, Vermeer to the Sistine Chapel and so forth. So the incredible wealth. There's no single answer of what is art and what is good art. I'm really interested in questions that actually have answers. And so when I gave a lecture at the San Jose Museum of Art, the director came up to me afterwards and praised my talk and said, but the art community, you'll have a hard time in the art community because they're interested in interpretations and you're interested in answers. And is that a cultural problem that we have to get over? And bit by bit, I'm happy to say, things, you know, once people hear more and more, they get more and more interested and say, oh, have you ever thought about this painting and that painting? So these are some of the most important images ever made. And it's, to me, really sort of shocking that how few people like me are using computer analysis, computer artificial intelligence and so forth, but this is really taking off. I mean, I'm teaching 3 courses at Stanford on it and teaching a course in Vienna in December. And there are a lot of other places all around the world where people are finally realizing that this is another way to look at art. I call it computer-assisted connoisseurship. So it's, I don't want to take too much time here, but you know, the way a microscope helps a biologist, these computer methods can help an art critic and art scholar and connoisseur.
And I think that, I mean, I think we've long known that we're interested in the conditions in which paintings are made. We've always been interested in Vermeer's conditions of children and poverty and all of that. And to think about this, the broader application for which we can learn more about the conditions of what we paint, in which things are made, is fascinating. Yeah,
well, I'm working on an article right now where I'm arguing that art interpretation is sort of a holy grail, a grand challenge for artificial intelligence, because unlike the kinds of problems in image analysis that computer vision is attacking now, like your photographs, oh, it's a great triumph to be able to say, oh, this is a photograph of a man pushing his daughter on a swing. Art is different. It's created with an intention, with a meaning, with a story, with trying to get something across, a message, if you will. And that's another level of sophistication and depth that everything from the nature of brushstrokes and the choices of colors to the composition and so forth all go into. I mean, when you're standing in front of an incredible masterpiece like, oh, I don't know, The Art of Painting, the amount of knowledge and information and sensitivity and vision that you bring to interpret something like that is absolutely overwhelming. It's extraordinary. And bit by bit, we want to chip away and figure out how do humans do it. So that's one other sort of sideline or side effect of this kind of work, is trying to understand how humans do these things. We're so good at them that we can't introspect and figure out how we know that that figure is Christ, or that he's, you know, doing this particular action. And by building our systems, we get some insight, at least on that. Anyway.
So I'm going to have one more question, and then we can say thank you to everybody. And the question is a great one. It's, Yolande, do you have any presentations coming up in the United States? What's on the horizon?
Oh, well, it's a pandemic. I can't go anywhere. Yeah, I have some things online. An artist in residence at UCLA coming up. So we'll see what pans out given the situation of travel and showing work in person. There are some things in the pipeline, but kind of, you know, changed.
It'll happen. And I have to say, the only art that I've seen in physical proximity since the beginning of the pandemic was, of course, your collaboration. And it was a wonderful opportunity to get to see it. So thank you all so much. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks for, hopefully you come back. And oh, there's a question that asks if the Radius Gallery shows online too.
Yes, it is online. You can see it on my website. And it's
Can you tell us what your website is?
Yes, it's yolandeharris.net.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So everybody can check it out and see what's going on next. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.